Since so many people didn't show up on time, I'm going to start now. I'm Don Viviani, and I'm going to introduce my co-presenters. First, Dr. James Hansen, and I don't think Jim really needs an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Jim is the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies, and he's the current director of Climate Science Awareness and Solutions, which is part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Jim is the author of the book Storms of My Grandchildren, and he's a principal author or co-author of innumerable papers on climate change and Earth's energy imbalance. He's best known, I think, probably for his testimony in the 80s on climate change, raising to Congress, which has raised awareness of the climate issue in the U.S. certainly, and probably throughout the world. So Jim, thanks for being part of the petition. Dan Galpern is the founder, general counsel, and executive director of Climate Protection and Resource Initiative. He's been fighting for the public interest all his life. Most recently, he's been the policy and legal advisor to petitioner Jim Hansen, and more importantly, while I had the idea for the petition, it was Dan was the one who really turned it into a force that might move the needle on climate, and without him, we wouldn't really be where we are today. So thank you, Dan, for everything you've done. As for me, I was at EPA for 35 years. I was director of the Climate Policy and Assessment Division, and germane to this, I was also the chairman of the U.S.-Canada Toxic Substances Committee for the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. I have a doctorate in chemistry. So that's it. And next, I guess I'd like to lead off. I get to lead off, and then Dan will go. I think that TSCA fits the climate problem like a glove. TSCA is a chemical safety act. It's supposed to control unreasonable risks from chemicals or mixtures to human health and the environment through regulations that, and what the statute says is restrict manufacturing, processing, distribution, e-commerce use, and disposal of chemicals and mixtures. Now, this disposal is the key phrase here. Greenhouse gas and fossil fuels fit that definition. They're chemicals and they're mixtures. They're causing climate change. Climate change is an existential risk. Existential risks that are avoidable can't be considered reasonable. So they fit under the TSCA regulatory authority. TSCA was designed to be used when other authorities are unable to protect human health and the environment. And if you just look at our history and where we are today, other authorities aren't working. So we need TSCA here. TSCA was designed to regulate chemicals that don't fit neatly into a single media. Climate has multiple ocean and terrestrial effects. Greenhouse gases pose risks at many points in their life cycle. All that stuff is covered under TSCA, and it's what TSCA is supposed to deal with. Dan will talk about West Virginia versus EPA in greater length, but I just wanted to get one point in. It was argued in West Virginia versus EPA that EPA was reinventing the Clean Air Act 111 as a climate authority. And it went on to say that the Clean Air Act is in the business of controlling air pollution, not telling the U.S. how to generate its energy, because EPA really isn't an expert in that. TSCA, on the other hand, is a chemical safety authority. This is a chemical safety question. EPA is in the business and is expert in controlling risks from chemical releases and exposure. We're not reinventing TSCA as a climate authority. We're doing what TSCA is supposed to do, controlling an unreasonable risk from a chemical release. Then the other thing I wanted to just mention has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's great that Congress was able to pass this, and I think it'll move us forward, but it only gets us part of the way. You don't stop swimming when you're halfway across the English Channel. I think using TSCA can get us the rest of the way to Calais, so it's really the perfect partner to the Inflation Reduction Act. How is it going to do that? One of the ways is through legacy emissions. That is disposal, which is also covered under TSCA. Disposed greenhouse gases continue to pose a risk. Unless we reduce concentrations through drawdown, we can't return to a stable climate. And I'm sure Jim will talk about this later. TSCA can require disposers to draw down or to pay into a drawdown fund. But the other thing about this is, in this case, the polluter pays, whereas in the incentives under the IRA, the taxpayer is on the hook for those incentives. The other thing is the other big thing is that a fee may be allowed under TSCA Section 6 or 9 authority, and possibly under the Independent Offices Appropriation Act, which is reachable through TSCA. Economists agree that a price on carbon is the most efficient way to address the externality. TSCA and TSCA can also deal with the border issue, the carbon border issue, because importation is defined as manufacturing. So TSCA can levy a fee on imports that don't comply with Section 6 requirements. The embedded carbon can be assessed a fee, and TSCA goes on to direct the Treasury to write rules to enforce this. The other thing about IRA incentives, they're not direct pay. So folks with no tax liabilities can't use them, for example, to install solar or heat pumps, that sort of thing. But a revenue neutral carbon fee would pay for those disenfranchised by these incentives. Tax credits tend to reproduce, not reduce existing economic inequalities. A direct pay would be a boon to the folks who can't take advantage of reducing their tax liabilities, and Congress may be more amenable to a rebate, even if it's not to the folks they usually like to rebate to. Carbon capture and storage, which is another giveaway to fossil fuel companies in the bill, is direct pay as opposed to the other incentives. And it extends our reliance on fossil fuel far into the future. A fee on carbon makes green energy more attractive. So that would help a lot. It also makes all of the additional drilling that the IRA allows a lot less attractive. So that's pretty much my piece. And now I'm gonna yield to Dan.
I think you're going to yield at this time to Jim.
Jim, I'm sorry, Jim.
All right, you hear me? Yeah. I just want to say one thing, but it's very fundamental. This new law will probably be helpful, but it's business as usual. It's the way of addressing climate that has been attempted ever since the Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992. Beginning with the Kyoto Protocol and going through all the subsequent agreements, Paris Agreement, and so on, where you're trying to stop some emission with some wishful thinking or economic incentive, subsidize some clean energy. In fact, if you look at the data on a global basis, that simply doesn't work. You get some countries that reduce their emissions, but as long as fossil fuels are not required to pay their cost to society in their price, we're not going to solve the problem. And I've been saying that for decades now, and economists sort of agree with that. I mean, Don said that they say, well, that's the most efficient way. I would say it's the only way. As long it's so cheap to get some fossil fuels out of the ground with the bulldozer. The price of getting oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia is almost zero compared to the price they sell it at. You're simply not going to solve the problem unless you put a price on carbon And we're not going to get a global price on carbon without um, without doing it in a way that the public will accept. And the United States has to lead, and it's not happening yet. And so all the celebrations about this law that's hopefully about to be passed are really exaggerated. We have to do what is fundamentally required, and TSCA gives you a route to that, which is our best hope for getting there. It's a great idea of Don to try to use this, and so it's really important. That's all that I want to say.
All right. Thank you, Don and Jim. This is the Dan Galpern, and I wrote a little bit about the IRA in my recent blog post that's on our website at cprclimate.org. But there is one thing I want to say that I didn't mention in that, and that is, and I think this is where most of the purported emissions reductions estimated by the Rhodium Group and Energy Innovations and the Repeat Project at Princeton University. I think this is probably where the majority of those that are purported come from. And that is the fee on methane emissions that are in the IRA. Now, it's weak compared to the Build Back Better plan, but still it's something. And there's a enormous exemption that can swallow the rule of the fee, namely in the event that a facility is compliant with the forthcoming methane emission regulations from EPA, then they would be exempt from the fee. But nonetheless, as the Congressional Research Service indicated just 6 days ago, this would be the first time that the federal government would directly impose a charge or a fee or a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. And so in that sense, one aspect of the IRA could serve as I think, important precedent to what Jim Hansen was just talking about. So let me just give a little more detail. Jim Hansen, Don Viviani, and 3 of their colleagues, including the well-known atmospheric chemist John Birx of the University of Colorado, Richard Heady, probably the most preeminent climate accountability expert, and Lissa von Susteren, a well-known physician and writer, especially with respect to the impacts on children of a diminished future, in conjunction with 2 organizations, including Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, filed this petition on June 16th. And by law, that kicked off a 90-day window for EPA to decide whether to accept this petition or not. So that brings us to September 14. So in less than 5 weeks from now, the agency needs to render its decision to accept or reject the petition. If they accept the petition, then they need to promptly, pursuant to the language in Section 21, the citizens' petition section, they need to promptly commence a rulemaking. And in that rulemaking, they need to, consider public they have to ensure public participation and the formulation of a strong rule. And Section 6 of the Act describes the authorities that they can utilize, and the charge to the agency is to impose restrictions as needed to eliminate the unreasonable risk to health or the environment. That's the requirement. And they include restriction to the point of prohibition, as Don alluded to, of these chemical substances or mixtures, namely their manufacturing, which includes production, their processing, distribution, use, and disposal. And so restriction to the point of prohibition of these chemical substances or mixtures and restriction or regulation of the method of disposal. Well, how do we dispose of greenhouse gases? We, to date, predominantly let it into the air. And so, especially in light of the long-lived nature of CO2 in the atmosphere, we confront here a continuing disposal problem. And so, and because we've so overshot the safe level of atmospheric CO2 and the other Kyoto 6 greenhouse gases, we need to both rapidly phase out greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to remove a substantial share of the overburden of CO2 and methane and the rest. So as Don said, because of the inadequacy to date of other authorities, we turn to TSCA, which fits this problem, as Don said, like a glove, and provides the agency with ample authority to address the problem. And so, we are here seeking everyone's support. Support can be had by endorsing the petition or sponsoring the campaign to help us get it across the finish line. And you can do it through the portal on our website or directly at EPA. Your submission of a public comment why you support strong restrictions under TSCA to address the climate crisis. All right, now, West Virginia. It's just not true that West Virginia said that the agency can no longer utilize the Clean Air Act to address the climate problem. But it did say that that agency, or any agency, is restricted in its ability to utilize authority where the utilization of that authority would impact a major industrial area. It's restricted from being too creative in its interpretation of the statute. In particular, the question was whether Section 111 of the Clean Air Act was so broad a conveyance of authority that it justified the Obama administration's promulgation of the Clean Power Plan, and in particular, its goal of replacing coal-fired power plants and secondarily, essentially coal-fired power plants with renewable energy generation. And that was a bridge too far for the language of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. But here we're not dealing with Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. In fact, we're not dealing with the Clean Air Act at all. We're dealing with the Toxic Substance Control Act, and there, as I indicated, the authority is much more expressly conveyed to the agency to do what is necessary to restrict, even to the point of prohibition, the chemical substances or mixtures that are presenting an unreasonable risk to health or the environment. The Supreme Court also warned against suddenly discovering new authority in a pre-existing statute. But here, with TSCA, there's a 44-year pedigree for this agency to apply that statute to a powerful greenhouse gas, namely chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. And in 1978, when the agency commenced the phase out of CFCs in its draft and final rules, it did so expressly because, number one, the CFCs or a powerful ozone depleting chemical. And number two, because they constitute powerful greenhouse gas. So it's not the case that there's no agency, precedent. There's a powerful precedent with respect to CFCs. The other point I wanted to make with respect to this is that this is not just our opinion. And by the way, the former general counsel of EPA, Edon Elliott, has written extensively about our approach, and we actually reprise one. We reprint his article on our website if people are interested in his view about why this works well. But I wanted to mention that in 2017, in the second most powerful court in the land, the DC Circuit Court, they confronted another rule by EPA, one intended to phase out, to compel removal of HFCs from refrigerators and aerosols and that sort of thing by manufacturers who previously had replaced CFCs in their products with HFCs, because at one time EPA had deemed HFCs to be a safe alternative to CFCs. And the court found that the agency did not have the authority to compel removal now of a second removal here of HFCs or replacement of them with a safer alternative, because they said that EPA was intending to do that not to protect the ozone layer, but the climate, because HFCs are not an ozone depleting substance, but they are powerful climate forcing agents. But, said the court, the agency retains ample other authority, including the Toxic Substances Control Act, to address the HFC climate problem. That was 2017. Notably after the amendments of 2016 into the Toxic Substances Control Act. And that opinion is important in my view, not only because of the court that said it, but because of the author of the opinion for the majority in that case, which was Brett Kavanaugh, now in the U.S. Supreme Court. So, circling back then to the question, we think that we're not entirely insulated from attack through litigation, but we have a very strong argument why, in the wake of the West Virginia decision, a strong rule under the Toxic Substances Control Act to get at greenhouse gas pollution should survive, and in part because of that decision, why it is so important to proceed under our petition through the authority of the Toxic Substance Control Act if we intend to do more than the little bit that was accomplished, that's being accomplished under the IRA. So with that, I think we could throw it open to questions, if that's okay, Don.
Yeah. People can raise their hand or they can write in the chat. Somebody did write in the chat already, Chris Harding, to everybody. Since carbon capture and storage is going to happen in the future, could this be considered production and transportation and assist the argument for regulations? And my answer was, yes, TSCA could write rules for a surety bond, for example. It could require monitoring for leakage, which is very expensive and very hard to do, especially once it's in the ground. And a carbon fee would apply to the CO2 in the life cycle, because there is CO2 in the life cycle of CCS. And also the CO2 that's not captured from the stack, because CCS doesn't capture it all. And the more you try to capture, the more expensive it becomes. On the other hand, CCS is important for cement and fertilizer production. So we like that incentive because right now there's no other way to control that. Green cement is I think is pretty far away right now.
See, Catherine Skopik has her hand, and if you could unmute yourselves, Catherine.
Thank you, all of you, for that wonderful presentation. It sounds like it's a very strong case. I would like to have these arguments somewhere so that when I go out to promote this, I can share them. Second question, and this is just kind of like being an advocate or like looking at it from another side. Is there any particular way that there could be some kind of argument about the longevity of the use of these toxic substances as an argument for their continuing use?
I actually don't really understand your question. An argument for the longevity of CO2 in the atmosphere and in the ocean.
Yes. Is there any particular way? No, the use of fossil fuels and methane. In other words, that the industry itself is such a strong, powerful industry with so much of a grip on the legislators and elected officials. Is there any way that they could possibly use the fact that they've been doing it for so long, even knowing the damage it's doing, that could somehow come out in the form of an argument against it? I don't know. It's not a very good question, but
I see. So could they argue that they have been allowed to treat the atmosphere as an open sewer for so long without objection that they should be allowed to continue?
exactly, you got it.
Right. And I've never heard. I've heard them attempt many arguments, but never something like that. And particularly where there is evidence that they bent our politics in order to preserve their ability to do this without any substantial regulation or the imposition of any fee. I think that their record is not would not drive confidence in a reviewing court or should not drive confidence with respect to agency considering what to do. I mean, remember, a number of the chemicals that have been restricted by the agency in the past had been utilized for a long period of time,
Okay.
and had well served society. Fossil fuels have well served society, but for the small problem of climate change, but also, of course, the imposition of health impacts because of particulate pollution and related pollution. So, no, I don't think that would be a compelling argument that they would advance.
Okay, can I have a brief follow-up, very brief? The CFCs, it was proven how that was affecting the ozone hole, in the southern hemisphere. So what specific, we have tons of evidence of what the carbon is doing, the fossil fuels are doing. Is there a specific source of data that?
Okay, so let me share the screen for a second. Is that okay, Don?
Yeah.
Give me a second here. So am I successfully sharing?
Yes.
Yeah, my picture's on there. Thank you.
Yeah. And Jim Hansen, and Jim is not showing his face here, but I'm revealing his face right on. All right. So anyhow, this is our website. Very convenient. The name of the organization is Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, but the website is cprclimate.org. CPR like we're in an emergency. cprclimate.org. Well, you can go there and then get to this petition page. Catherine, and okay. The petition page has a very small description, but then also if you click on Get the Facts, there's a 2-page fact sheet.
Ah, okay.
Okay. Then also for the intrepid, both parts of the petition are provided here, and people could download that and, you know, read it if you're having trouble getting to sleep. But each part has its own executive summary of just a few pages each. The part 2 is a distillation of the science, our distillation, and 75 pages. And part 1 is just 37 pages, and that's the law and policy. And we also talk about the CFC precedent there. And then just finally, since I'm here, there's the ability for people to here endorse and sponsor the effort, either as individuals or organizations. And you, by the way, if you do this, not to promote too much, but you will be in good company. Get rid of those characters. But here's the sampling of petition endorsers here, and we list all of our organizational as well, and then campaign sponsors. So anyhow, we're trying to make it as easy as possible. Now, also in the realm of making things as easy as possible, we also have devised a public comment portal. And it's just not cooperating right now, but that's because I have this in the way. Okay, here you go. And so if you have just a very short thing to say in public comment, you could use our portal. But if you have a longer comment that you wish to make, if you wish to attach a PDF, or if you wish your comment to be counted as a standalone comment and not part of the collection that are done through our portal, then we would urge you to go directly to EPA's public comment form, and that is provided here on this page. So it's all available through cprclimate.org. And yeah, that's more of an answer than you sought, but does that answer your questions, Catherine? Okay, we'll assume that it did.
Dan, I think Dave Carl had a question. Dave, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks so much, Don. And first of all, thank you to the CPR Climate Group. This is an enormous effort, and your website is very professional and easy to navigate. Dan's webinar on the West Virginia VEPA was an incredible webinar, so I encourage you all to take a look at that if you haven't seen that yet. I'm an oceanographer, and I had a quick question for Dan about the Toxic Substance Control Act and comparing the CO2 with CFCs, the latter being a wholly man-made product, human-made product, whereas CO2 has a natural source and always has. So I could just see some people being confused with CO2 as a toxin because it's necessary for photosynthesis and so on and so forth. And most of the CO2, for example, that goes across the ARC interface every day is of the natural type, not the anthropogenic type. So that's just something that I don't know. I haven't read the entire petition, and maybe you discussed that. And it has to do with the legacy carbon and how low you would like EPA to draw the atmospheric carbon pool down to. Would it be all the way down to 280, which was the pre-industrial, or would it be some value between the 400 plus that we have today and the 280 and the 1700s?
All right. Well, you addressed this to me, but I am going to refer this to both Don and Jim. Jim, to the question of how low do we need to go, and to Don to discuss man-made and artificial, and then I'll fill in the blanks if they haven't sufficiently answered. Jim, how low do we need to go?
Yeah, that was a question we addressed now 14 years ago in 2008 with the paper Target CO2. where should humanity aim? And our conclusion was, which was quite a surprise at the time, was it was certainly less than 350 ppm. And at that time, the target that the framework convention process was aiming for was 450 ppm. Now, it's become clear that the eventual target is going to have to be pretty low, but it's not, you can't give a single number for CO2 because the greenhouse effect is coming from other gases. The human-made greenhouse effect is caused by a range of gases, some of which have a very long lifetime. So we don't really need to know. I actually made that point in the 350 paper that it's going to take us a long time to turn the abundance around and get back toward the neighborhood of 350. And by that time, we'll be able to set a more specific target. But you know, I'm actually working on a paper which will address this comment a little more specifically. But it's become clear recently that the climate is more sensitive than has been thought, and we're already at a level with our current greenhouse gases. We're at a level that would cause a eventual warming of several degrees Celsius, which is just crazy. It would not have a livable planet, would not have our coastlines where they are now. So anyway, I'm kind of avoiding answering your question, but it's the eventual target is going to have to be very low, significantly less than 350 ppm. That's all I'd like to say at the moment.
Yeah, can I just add something? As far as synthetic versus natural, TSCA has regulated natural compounds. For example, it regulates formaldehyde, and that's which is also a gas, and it's also sort of a secondary effect. It regulates particle board that contains entrained formaldehyde that's released. So it does regulate naturally occurring stuff. The other thing too is, I mean, Dave, as you probably understand better than I do, the CO2 in the atmosphere is sort of in dynamic equilibrium. And natural is most of it. But the problem that we have is, as Jim alluded to earlier, is that people make lots of money putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and they don't make much bringing it down. And the only way we can address that overburden of CO2 is by monetizing, drawing it down. And once we do that, we can restore the equilibrium somewhat, and we can also model a lot better, because one of the hardest things to model is innovation. And if we monetize drawdown, we know that innovation will increase, and we probably can have a better handle on it. I don't know if that answers it, but.
Okay, Dave, did we get to that sufficiently?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you. You know, as an aside, I haven't read this IRA legislation carefully, but does anybody on this call know if there's money for research on carbon dioxide sequestration that goes along with this act to actually get started on this?
There was a significant amount of money in the Infrastructure Act. This bill does increase the amount of allowable credit under the 45Q program in the United States, which is available for direct capture programs, and maybe also for BECs. Yeah, so there is some significant money there for that.
Thank you.
Anita, you have a question?
So my question was with CCS, how does one avoid the oil industry, the oil and gas industry, from using that as the big push to take it out of the atmosphere instead of stopping it from getting in the first place, like stop, exploiting and going for more oil and gas instead of pouring all the money into trying to get it out afterwards? Because that doesn't seem to be, I mean, there's a ton of money now into research on how we do CCS versus focusing all out on renewable and then using CCS for those like cement production and stuff that we can't do very well, reducing it. If anybody had comments on that.
Well, John and I were actually talking about this and before the call, and my thinking is that first of all, there needs to be performance standard, and if CCS does not work well, and of course it's not even close to being demonstrated at scale, but if it's not working well, and we had a carbon fee, well then they would be required to pay that fee, or so that's one thing. If we had a carbon fee, which we don't now, we're one of the only countries that don't. If we don't, then that will be a problem. But the second way that this petition would get at it, and by the way, I should say, the formal ask of the agency, the only thing they need to determine by September 14 is whether or not greenhouse gas pollution and major sources present an unreasonable risk to health of the environment. And so everything else that we talk about in the petition is beyond that. We attempt to outline what we think should happen, but they can, but EPA needs to make the decision about the actual rule through rulemaking subsequent to its threshold determination. So that's the only determination that we formally are demanding that they render at this stage. In any event, the second way that major sources or the fossil fuel industry would be held liable under our view, pursuant to our petition, would be the imposition of a requirement that they remove an increasing share of their legacy emissions or pay for that to be done into a fund that we call the Atmospheric Carbon Abatement Fund in the petition. So initially, the major entities would be, under our thought here, would be held liable for 50% of their legacy emissions since 1992. Because 1992 was the year in which the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was passed and signed ratified in the U.S. Senate. But their share of their obligation would grow by 1 percentage point a year until somewhere in the neighborhood of 2070, any emissions would have to be removed. So so we deal with it in two ways: a phase-out obligation, and that could be done by regulation or fee. If by fee, the fee would be imposed on power plants with CCS to the extent that they're not 100%. The CCS is not 100% effective in safely sequestering the CO2 from the atmosphere and other GHG emissions from the atmosphere, or other regulation to the point of prohibition, a phase-out requirement imposed by EPA. And then secondly, by the imposition of the requirement that major sources remove a reasonable, fair share of their legacy emissions, climbing to 100% as we go along in future years. I'm cycling through the large list, Don, to see if there are other people with their hands up. Also, there appears to be some new chats.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we should, I don't know how to deal with this. There's Patrick has a question directed to you, Dan.
Oh, I see. Patrick Parento. Hi, Patrick. Patrick asks, Dan, TSCA Section 9B requires EPA to act under other laws, including the Clean Air Act, unless it finds that it's in the public interest to act under TSCA. How did you deal with this in the petition? So that's correct. Where there are other authorities available to the agency to adequately address the problem complained of in the petition, here greenhouse gas pollution, those other laws need to be utilized unless the agency determines that it's in the public interest that there be action under TSCA. And my reading of these provisions together is that they could utilize these other authorities and TSCA if it's in the public interest, or if these other laws that are within control of EPA are sufficient, then they should utilize those other statutes. And as Don indicated at the outset, there are other authorities, but they have not yet proved sufficient to eliminate the unreasonable risk imposed by these chemical substances and mixtures. But in the petition, Patrick, we do specifically say that pursuant to Section 9B, the agency should well, let me just back up and say, in filing this petition, we are not indicating that we think that other statutes should not be utilized. We think that TSCA works well with other statutes, and TSCA needs to be utilized because the others on their own are inadequate to fully address the problem. So anyhow, specifically to your point, you'll see in part 1 of the petition, Patrick, that we urge the agency to utilize other authorities and say that it must do so because of Section 9 to the extent available, but because those are likely inadequate to the problem and so far have proved inadequate as a full to develop a full decarbonization program in the United States, such as is required to meet the challenge, TSCA Section 6 authorities also should be utilized.
Dan, Kathy has her hand up.
Okay, I don't see her, but hi, Kathy.
Hi, greetings from Canada, where we do have a carbon fee and dividend system and where we are getting checks from our government from our carbon pricing policy. It's wonderful. I hope the United States will have it soon. For those of you who don't know me, I sit on the board at CPRI. I'm so honored to work alongside such amazing people. And I also work as the National Director of Citizens Climate Lobby Canada and the Director of Programs at Citizens Climate International. And I am following this so closely because I am, well, you're our biggest trading partner, okay? And whatever happens in the USA impacts us. So here's my read on it. And if you want to elaborate or add to it, that's great. The IRA is not a silver bullet. It's not going to get us to the 350 parts per million that we need, not even close. And the taxpayer can't afford the transition. But carbon fee and dividend, it's not a silver bullet either, but I see the two of them working together. I'm really excited for what's happening. So it's a step in the right direction. And the IRA with the carbon fee and dividend policy in the USA would be wonderful. And just a tiny bit about carbon pricing around the world. The United States and Japan are the only two G7 countries that do not price carbon pollution nationally. 46 countries do price pollution nationally. Lastly, the European Union, Canada, Chile, many of the Latin American countries are working on WTO compatible border carbon adjustment mechanisms. So it's coming. So just keep pushing. And thank you, Dan, and everybody, Dr. Hansen, everybody who is supporting this this provision in TSCA to push this forward. I just think the two together are just amazing. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Kathy.
Dan, Chris Harding has a question. I'm not quite sure I understand it. Chris, did you want to talk about that?
Sure. Dr. Mark Jacobson and Dr. Sudhir Joshi from Berkeley, from Stanford and Berkeley, both said that when direct air capture is used, when fossil fuels are on the electrical grid, that more CO2 is emitted than is captured. And the reason for this is because the renewable energy used to run the CO2 direct air capture could be used to replace fossil fuels on the market, or on the electrical grid rather, and it produces more CO2 if you do a mass balance and material balance around the systemic processes. And so the question I have is, well, the US government is pushing for direct air capture, and they know that this can happen. And the reason why they know this is because Dr. Joshi and Dr. Jacobson and Dr. Mann has informed them, but they're still pushing for direct air capture. So my question is, and I was leading to and implying, could there be a conflict between your guys' petition and the US government's goals?
I would hope that the US government's goal is to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But they have to serve they do serve two masters. Obviously, industry does have a lot of influence.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I'm capturing your question, Chris, because it's as Dr. Hansen has pointed out, and has the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has reaffirmed we've already substantially overshot the safe level of atmospheric CO2 and the other Kyoto 6 greenhouse gases, and so we need to both rapidly phase out continuing emissions, and we need to remove some substantial share. Now, it used to be that it was deemed plausible to remove that substantial share through more natural methods such as afforestation or agricultural improvements, use, for example, of biochar as a soil amendment, and there may be other methods that are quite feasible and scalable, although significant research still needs to be done to prove that with respect to enhanced weathering. I think, in fact, we may even have the world's authority on the on this meeting today on that, David Bierling. But in any event, the petition is technology neutral and indicates that that both is needed. That is to say, both a rapid phase out of emissions and additional research into methods to remove the excess. And I understand that a lot of money is being sunk into, not sunk, I don't mean to be pejorative, but into CCS and to direct air capture and into BECCS, and we would favor we favor a reasonable evaluation of technologies and the whole panoply, and then compelling the industry at least to pay for some share. By the way, under TSCA, industry could also be compelled to pay for the evaluation of such technologies, rather than the taxpayers alone paying for this. So anyhow, that's sort of rambling, Chris. I hope it gets a little bit at your question.
It did, thank you.
Bob Briggs asked, assuming an affirmative determination by EPA, what might be a best case timeline for rulemaking, months, years, decades? If TSCA decides to use a Section 6 eminent risk, they don't have to go through proposal. They can go directly to rulemaking and make their regulations immediately effective as soon as they write them. Or they could file an immediate civil action once they decide what to do. But it will take a couple of years in any case, because you still have to go through OMB and you have to have a work group. All we're asking is that they make the unreasonable risk decision, and then it's up to them to decide the best way to make sure that they allay that unreasonable risk. The question that I had is that if the agency decides that climate is a reasonable risk, is that going to hamstring them later when they try to go forward with regulation on climate? I mean, I think they have to consider that.
Yeah. And so, John, let me just amend your answer just a little bit. First of all, it's Section 7, imminent hazard, not Section 6. And that is correct that the agency could do that. But my legal judgment is that's permissible. But under Section 6, upon the agency's determination that these chemicals, and also Section 21, the citizens petition section, upon the acceptance of the petition and finding that we have shown that there's that these chemical substances impose an unreasonable risk, they must act to commence a rulemaking. So Section 7, yes, they could act and propose a set of requirements, and those could be immediately effective if they've commenced a civil action, a court case. But under Section 6, all they need to do is commence the rulemaking. And in that rulemaking, they can, in our view, they should hold public hearings around the country, in part to allow exceptionally disadvantaged or highly impacted communities to participate. They should be enabled to participate and facilitated by the agency, as well as to secure the expert advice, all the expert advice that's requisite to fashioning a strong rule. And so I think that could take a number of months, perhaps slightly more than a year. But the agency has been researching this issue for a long time, and certain techniques of control and imposition of fees are well understood with respect to restricting other pollutants, and I think they need not take much more than that. Don, I think Anita has another question.
So this isn't totally in line with the area we've been covering, but just a thought. All the subsidies the oil and gas industry has been getting through time and continue to get, that would pay for an awful lot of electric cars and such. So what can one do parallel to the other efforts to change that and switch it over to renewable, or give it in the hands of the people so they can move on with this? Seeing as we all consider this being an emergency, like a real emergency, just a thought.
I think that is fully consistent with our advocacy, including what Jim Hansen has been arguing for 20 years. We should be making fossil fuels pay their full cost to society and the environment, and certainly removing the special dispensations that they receive through the tax code would be part of that. Jim, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you answered that.
Okay, Catherine.
I commend you for your excellent work. It's very uplifting. Two questions very briefly. One, what is the block for us not having pay for the carbon, like Canada, like Kathy was saying, Canada, what's preventing it from happening? And the second question is, Jim Hansen referred to other sources of greenhouse gases other than, what we have with the fossil fuels. What would some of those be? I mean, we have permafrost melting, putting more methane in, but I was just curious from Jim as to what are some of those other sources. He mentioned other sources. So what's blocking us from having a carbon, paying for carbon? And what are some of the other sources of greenhouse gases that Jim referred to?
Okay, this is Jim. Well, what's blocking us is the industry and the people who are making money from the current way of doing things. And we have two political parties which are both accepting funds from special interests. So it's very difficult to get political actions that are simply designed for the public's best interest. A good example was the prior attempt. When Obama was elected, he said that we had a planet in peril and we should take some action to address that. Well, they tried to do it through a Waxman-Markey bill rather than a simple carbon fee and dividend. And that ended up several thousand pages long because I met with Senator Kerry, who was shepherding Obama's attempt in Congress, and he agreed that fee and dividend made sense, but he said, I can't get one vote for that because Congress people think they need to respond to the special interests that are supporting them. It's not the way a democracy is supposed to work, but we don't have political parties that are willing to take money out of politics. John McCain talked about campaign finance reform, but couldn't get support from Congress. They're not willing to give up their sources of money. So that's the fundamental problem. Canada is making progress in getting a carbon fee and dividend. Maybe we can do it, but it's hard to do it when you're fighting against special interests who have the ability to bribe Congress.
I think they can hear us talk now. I think they can hear us talk.
Dan?
And very briefly, thank you for that, James Hansen. Briefly, you referred to other sources of greenhouse gas emissions and methane other than fossil fuels. Now, I know the melting permafrost is a big one for methane and shallow reservoirs caused by the mega dams in Canada. But what are some of the other sources?
Well, I was referring also to other gases, which other human-made gases. But but what you are asking about then, with your example of permafrost, is a feedback. The warming does cause the release of additional greenhouse gases. We know this very well from the Earth's history. But the way to stop that, we can actually stop that, and that is to stop the warming. And even we're going to actually have to reverse the warming to at least some degree if we want our shorelines to stay close to where they are. Now, the time scale that we have to do that is, I argue, of the order of a century, but we will need to shut off those feedbacks. And the way to do that is to stop the warming and to some degree reverse it.
43 participants.
Okay, great. It looks like Don and Jim, my father is there raising his hand.
He says,
Talk.
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
yes, he can hear you.
I have a question.
Speak loud.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go right ahead.
There has been any number of news reports about burning forests. So my question is, how much of a factor in this mix is the burning of forests, and what can we do to control it, stop it?
Jim, I'll let you take that.
Well, it's the same answer as the last one I gave. The forest burning is related to the climate change. We're getting more intense fires. So we need to stop and reverse the warming. And not necessarily putting out the fires. That's a subject on its own right. Fires are natural, but they become unnatural. And we need to move back to a more hospitable climate. But the forests are actually doing a pretty good job of taking up carbon, despite all of our missteps and deforestation. If you look at the CO2 accumulated in the atmosphere each year, it's only about 55% of our emissions, because despite our poor management of forests and soils and our agricultural practices, the system is taking up CO2 at a substantial rate, almost half of our emissions. And some of that is going into the ocean. Probably about half of what's disappearing is disappearing in the ocean. But it's also being taken up by the soil and the forests. And therefore, if we decrease the fossil fuel emissions by more than half, and we're going to have to do it, if we decrease the emissions enough, the system itself will begin drawing down CO2. It takes time, but it is, nature is willing to help us if we will just give it a hand.
That's you, honey. Yeah.
Okay, well, good answer, but those people whose homes have been eaten up by forest fires, and they're occurring not only in California and the American West, but all over the world, that's small consolation to people that are impoverished and destitute
And homeless.
and homeless. And what government policies should be pushed to to encourage reforestation and absorption of the gases.
Well, there are incentives. You can give incentives for drawdown of CO2 via agricultural and forestry practices and financially reward those, but they will be relatively fruitless if we don't get the warming under control. Because
True.
what happens is you reforest, but then you get, if you're encouraging larger, more extreme fires, you end up losing that CO2 back into the air. So we've got to attack the fundamental problem, and that is actually decreasing emissions to a point that we're actually decreasing the level of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's the fundamental requirement.
And we should let other people ask some questions also, if that's okay here.
I think what the whole situation reminds me of is a firing squad that formed a circle.
Good analogy. Good analogy. Does anybody want to say anything about blue carbon, Jim or Dave? Because that wasn't mentioned at all. Jim Baker or Dave Carl. I don't know if you want to weigh in on blue carbon and its role. Well, I maybe I could say something. I mean, one of the biggest problems with CO2 is the fact that it's acidifying the ocean, and the oceans do provide half of our oxygen, and we're killing a lot of the phytoplankton through acidification and warming that are doing that. So it's important to get the CO2 under control. But the oceans can also provide an enormous source of drawdown, and hopefully the petition can monetize that. I don't see any more questions unless I'm missing something in the chat. If you wrote something in the chat that wasn't addressed, can you raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up?
Just very briefly, Don, information about public comments. Will that be forthcoming when the rulemaking is made or completed?
Yeah, the docket is available now to look at to see who's commented. So you just go to our website, and there's a link to where the regulations, where the docket is, and you can go and look. Right now, there aren't a lot of comments because they don't have all the comments that were sent to CPRI yet.
Okay, thank you, Don.
But so just to hope you're clear on this, Catherine, EPA is accepting comments right now.
Oh, good. Okay.
And
great.
so you can get there by looking at our public comment page on our website, cprclimate.org. And then that will take you to, we provide the link to EPA's portal.
Thank you so much.
David has his hand up. David, did you want to go ahead?
Yes. If the panelists deem it worthwhile discussing, are any of you familiar with the work of Peter Fikowski and his recent book called Climate Restoration, which addresses biomimicry using things like marine permaculture, sargassum farms in small areas around the world in the oceans as ways to rapidly reduce CO2, to draw down CO2 emissions, synthetic limestone, and another one I don't remember.
Yeah, certainly. Klaus Lackner at I guess he's at Arizona now. Is a huge believer in carbon drawdown using olivine and other minerals to take the CO2 and put it permanently into a carbonate. In fact, you can actually do that with old cement. You can break it up and lay it out, and it'll draw it down. And I think that we have to use every tool that we have, because this is something that's been caused by large and small sources. So we have to use large and small drawdown methods.
I want to follow up with the other his other recommendation, which is ocean iron. What is it called?
Fertilization.
Fertilization, right? I understand this has had it's been around for a while, and there's some controversy, but I find his approach to make sense, because he suggests that it be done incrementally and then monitored as it's done, to see if there are any negative feedback loops created by it, but if not, to increase that. Anyways, I just thought I'd mention it because I found it to be an excellent book, worthwhile of consideration. Ties into a lot of what we're talking about today.
Rather than me make a mistake, why don't I just ask Dave to respond to that?
David, thank you so much for bringing that up. I would encourage the people on this call to look at the EXIOS website, EXIOS, Exploring Iron Ocean Solutions. And Peter Fikowski is one of the members of this XIOS group, as I am. And it's a great website to talk about ocean iron fertilization and its potential role in carbon sequestration. I would also point out that the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published a major report in December of last year, and that's available on the web at the National Academy website, on ocean carbon sequestration protocols or procedures or possibilities. And that includes iron fertilization, it includes mariculture, it includes the sargassum aquaculture that you mentioned, and includes ocean nutrient addition and so on and so forth. So there's a major 400+ page report on from the National Academy on that subject. So thanks for bringing those up.
Thank you.
See, Todd Weber has his hand up, Don. Yeah. Hey, Todd, you're not muted, but we cannot hear you. I don't know how to advise, but why don't you put it in chat, Todd, and we'll try to answer. Maura asks, why is the EPA the appropriate entity for implementing or enforcing the initiative, or for that matter, anything at all, given its history of complicity with industry and multiple failures to properly ID dangerous chemicals in the environment, let alone enforce its regulations? Most of us know that there are tens of thousands of unregulated chemicals in our household and even personal body care products, and EPA has failed to publicize the dangers, or even those it knows are serious health risks, as recent EPA whistleblowers have revealed. Okay, well, that's a hell of a question. Don, I give that to you.
Yeah, I mean, I stand second to none in crying the inadequacy of the Environmental Protection Agency. I work there, and lots of the regulations are terrible, but some of them do a lot of good. I mean, we have made strides. The air's a lot cleaner. The water's a lot cleaner. The rivers aren't catching on fire anymore. So we occasionally do the right thing. And TSCA was designed specifically to deal with this sort of problem. So I think that's why we're saying that we ought to regulate it under TSCA. And if they do enforce TSCA to the extent that they can, and people do yell about it and scream about it and hold EPA's feet to the fire, that I think that this will work.
See, Apple has Apple is holding her hand up.
Yep, Brian Appleby.
Okay, Brian Appleby. Couldn't see you in the small picture.
Yeah, well, I'm here from the UK, And during the last week, I've spent some time looking at our climate change committee's reports, which are presented to Parliament. And I'd never done it before, but I was actually astounded at the amount of detail on looking at every aspect, every possible impact on the UK of climate breakdown. And I just wondered, as part of your policy or your role, have you considered trying to implement a climate change committee of some kind, either nationally or through states? Because what was useful about it is this committee, because it does a presentation, it is actually educating our politicians. And many of them are sort of like yours, like a lot of yours, sort of in some kind of denial state. So if you had such a committee which had to formally present information on climate breakdown in detail, it could make quite a substantial difference. I know you've just made this amazing move forward in the last few days. It just seems to me there might be a good idea to have a policy which is to produce climate change committees. Has that been considered?
Well, Jim and Don, I could try to take a stab at this. Brian, we don't have exactly such as climate change committee, but we have agencies of the government. We have and we also have had the National Climate Assessment, which has been issued to Congress every couple of years. And we have report after report from the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency that we have actually petitioned here. And they publish an annual publication on greenhouse gas emissions. They've published recently a report on impacts nationwide of climate change, and those reports are specifically to the president and to Congress. So, and in addition to that, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which the United States, along with every other nation, is a member. And then we have a number of environmental agencies that have issued their own reports, not only the Environmental Protection Agency, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they, all of them issue periodic reports and annual reports. So it's, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that it's not for lack of information that is conveyed to Congress.
All right. It's just from this side of the pond, we're now seeing this as an emergency. You've probably seen all the stuff that's happening in Europe at the present time. It'll certainly wake Europe up. Sort of been astonished in the UK to have fires where houses were burned down associated with, and definitely associated with climate change.
Yes.
And people weren't expecting it. And there are lots of people still in denial. But I think this is beginning to wake them up, to have deep droughts throughout Europe. People are waking up that things have got to be done. So, I mean, the level of emergency, and I'm sure Jim would agree, it's a deep emergency now. It's not like next year, the year after, or 10 years from now. It's already at a very nasty point, and it could be at a turning point very, very soon. And that's why I just thought, you sound like you've got lots of things going on there. But I was pretty amazed by the Climate Change Committee. It's one subject. It could have been like a branch of an environmental protection agency, but it stands alone.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because you're going to get you're going to get the facts. You're going to get the scientific facts, which can be irrefutable. And people sitting there thinking it's not real,
right,
are going to be awakened.
Yeah. Well, I'll let Jim and Don, who both worked for decades for government, to weigh in on the question. I don't think it's a bad idea, but we want to see what they think.
We have different views of facts, unfortunately, here in the United States. But Jim, you probably ought to talk about it because you spent a lot of your life yelling at Congress.
Jim said he signed off.
Ah, okay.
Okay. All right. Well, Brian, thanks very much, and I do appreciate the point that you have that you've made, and I mean I can just add that this is the first time that we've had a national climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, who used to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and so at least within the White House there is a single person who's supposed to be advising on climate policy with respect to the United States. And also we have a high-level official, John Kerry, who is the national climate envoy. So he is the U.S. representative to the rest of the world. But in terms of having a federal climate change committee, you know, I'd be all for it if there were, you know, if there were reason to do that. All right. Todd, you still have your hand up. Are you still trying? Todd Weber?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry for the Bluetooth problem. I just wanted to offer the Jerry Franklin's comments earlier. Out here in California, literally just across the last couple of years in response to the massive fires, communities have begun to realize that they need to establish explicit community climate resilience plans. If you went back 3 and 4 years, that was not a term that any of our communities paid any attention to. The communities that have now experienced the smoke, the fires, the loss of portions of their communities have realized that they actually have to go through the effort of planning for local climate disasters. What do they do with the people that are displaced? If a neighboring community has a climate disaster, does each community next to it know what to do to help that community? This is still a fairly new way of thinking here in California, but it's not at an EPA level as EPA works to get the long-term things back on track. In the in-between, local communities are the only place that resolution to the immediate disasters can occur. And so far, without that focused lens of community climate resilience plans, the communities are not talking about, if this happens to our community, how do we react locally? And I can say that in the new bill that's waiting for Congress to sign off Friday, there are additional funds that go through disaster relief channels, but those presume that communities know how and when they would ask for those additional emergency funds. So to all of those people that say, why doesn't the EPA come up with a good answer for the communities that are being damaged today? The EPA can't do that, but communities can, and you, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, the idea of community resilience planning has kicked up, and some of the new and the best work is going on out here in California. I hope that makes sense to people, but there isn't anything that the EPA is in a position to do for next week's fires or next year's fires. But communities really need to ask themselves, what will they do? And pretty much every community today needs to ask itself, what kind of climate emergencies might they incur in the next 5 to 10 years? And really figure out, how will they deal with it? Does that make sense? I offer that just as background. It's been phenomenal out here in California to see the communities that are going, oh yeah, we probably ought to have that discussion and figure out how do we respond for our community and our neighboring communities. I don't know if that's helpful, but big change out here in California as that progresses as a way of dealing with the problem that climate change isn't coming anymore. The disasters are around the corner, or they were last week. And we're trying to get communities to pay attention to that. Is that helpful at all?
Yes,
Very.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. If anybody else has a question, please put their hand up. Otherwise, maybe we should.
Yeah, we've been going for over 90 minutes, and we can do this again for this group, and we will do another meeting for the CPR Initiative supporters and endorsers within the next couple of weeks. So I'd like to thank everyone for their participation and excellent questions, and we can't do this without broader support. So we sure hope that people will consider going to cprclimate.org and endorsing if you haven't endorsed, and sponsoring the campaign if you haven't done that already, and submitting comments to EPA. So thank you all from me, and Don, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.